They fired me at 5:02 p.m., 5 minutes after the elevators stopped running to the executive floor. The timing wasn't accidental. It never is. Companies like to end things when the building is quiet and witnesses are scarce. My name is Claire Donovan. I'm 27 years old. And until that evening, I was a junior compliance analyst at a fintech firm in Chicago that loved to brag about transparency while practicing secrecy like a competitive sport. The meeting lasted exactly 9 minutes. HR sat to my left, legal on my right. My manager across the table pretending to be deeply fascinated by a legal pad he never once wrote on. They used phrases like organizational, realignment, and performance, concerns without explaining either. When I asked for specifics, HR smiled and said all relevant details are outlined in the separation packet. Then she slid a folder towards me like she was passing dessert. I didn't cry. That surprised them. Instead, I asked for time to read. Legal shifted in his chair. My manager cleared his throat. HR said, "Of course." The way people say, "of course," when they mean, "please don't." I opened the folder and started reading. Every page slowly, carefully, the way my dad taught me to read contracts when I was 16 and wanted to sign my first apartment lease. He'd said, never rush when someone is trying to hurry you. The packet was 24 pages long. Severance, 8 weeks. Benefits, through the end of the month. Non-disclosure, non-disparagement, non-solicitation. Standard stuff. Too standard. What caught my eye wasn't the money or the threats wrapped in legal language. It was a sentence buried deep on page 11 under a bold heading titled, Termination for Performance-Based. Because it said any termination based on performance deficiencies must include documented warnings, written evaluations, and a completed performance improvement plan attached as Exhibit C must, not made. I paused, then I flipped to the back of the packet. No exhibits, no attachments, just white space and page numbers. I looked up and asked, "Where's Exhibit C?" HR blinked. Legal frowned. My manager finally looked at me. "There is no Exhibit C," HR said. "Then this isn't a performance-based termination," I replied. Legal's pen stopped moving. "They told me it was an administrative oversight. They told me not to worry. They told me everyone signs this." I signed anyway, every page, every line, because I suddenly understood something important. When a company forgets its own rules, it creates a paper trail of its mistakes. And mistakes, when documented, have a funny way of becoming leverage. At 1:46 a.m., my phone rang from a blocked number. I smiled before I answered. I let the phone ring long enough to feel the vibration crawl across my nightstand like a warning. When I finally answered, the voice on the other end sounded breathless. Controlled panic wrapped in professionalism. "Claire Donovan, this is Mark Reynolds from Latham & Howe, outside counsel for Northbridge Financial. I'm calling regarding the separation documents you signed earlier this evening." Outside counsel, not HR, not my manager. That alone told me everything. Companies don't wake there like there's a 2 in the morning unless something has gone very wrong. "Yes," I said, keeping my voice soft, neutral, harmless. "We need to clarify whether you fully executed the agreement." I signed exactly what was presented to me. There was a pause, the kind where someone is rapidly rethinking every decision that led them to this moment. "Did you review the exhibits?" "I did," I replied. "All 0 of them." Another silence, heavier this time. I could almost hear someone covering the receiver, whispering urgently in the background. Mark came back on the line, sounding less confident. "There appears to have been a clerical error. The performance documentation should have been attached." "Should have," I repeated. "But wasn't. We'd like to correct that." "I'm not sure you can. Here's the thing about compliance work. It teaches you how systems fail. Not because people are evil, but because they're rushed, careless, or convinced rules don't apply to them." Northbridge had spent years telling regulators how seriously they took internal controls. I helped write those policies. I knew where the cracks were. And now one of those cracks had a spotlight on it. Mark started explaining how they could send revised documents, how this would be simpler for everyone, how litigation benefits no one. I listened politely while scrolling through the PDF on my phone, stopping again at that sentence on page 11. Must include documented warnings. I'd never received a single written warning. My last performance review 3 months earlier rated me exceeds expectations. I'd save the copy. Always save a copy. Mark, I said finally, if Northbridge terminated me for performance, and you failed to provide required documentations, then either the termination was improperly classified or agreement is defective. That's a legal interpretation, he said quickly. It's also a factual one. He asked if I'd be willing to meet the following week to discuss options. I told him I'd consider it after speaking with counsel. That's when his voice tightened. You have an attorney? I will, I said, by morning. When I hung up, my apartment felt different charged, like the air before a storm. I wasn't celebrating. I was scared. I was 27, unemployed, and about to challenge a company with more lawyers than employees on my entire floor. But fear has a strange side effect. It sharpens memory. I remembered every late night, every risk memo ignored, every time leadership told us to be flexible with rules designed to protect people. The next morning, I called an employment attorney named Rachel Myers. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she laughs softly, not because it was funny, but because it was familiar. Claire, she said, they didn't just make a mistake. They handed you proof. By noon, Northbridge emailed asking me not to speak to anyone about my termination. By 3 p.m., Rachel had sent them a preservation notice demanding all internal communications related to my role. By evening, I understood something most people never do until it's too late. Being underestimated is a dangerous thing. For the people doing the underestimating, Monday morning I walked into Rachel Myers' office carrying a tote bag that held my entire professional life printed performance reviews, internal emails, policy manuals, and the thumb drive I'd kept just in case. Because compliance teaches you paranoia disguised as preparedness. Rachel spread everything across her conference table, like a detective reconstructing a crime scene. She didn't rush. She didn't reassure me with empty optimism. She read every word, to every clause. When she finally looked up, her expression had shifted from curiosity to something sharper. They classified you as a performance termination, she said, tapping the policy manual with her pen. That triggers procedural safeguards they didn't follow. This isn't just sloppy. It's actionable. I exhaled for the first time in days. So I'm not crazy. No, she said. You're inconvenient. Northbridge requested a meeting that same afternoon. Rachel insisted on attending. We arrived at their glass-walled headquarters and were ushered into a conference room with a view of the river. Because companies like to surround uncomfortable conversations with pretty distractions. 3 people were waiting. Mark Reynolds from outside counsel, the HR director who'd fired me, and a senior vice president I'd never met. No one offered coffee. Mark started talking immediately. We want to resolve this amicably. Rachel smiled. So do we. That usually starts with acknowledging the problem. They slid a new packet across the table. This one had exhibits, 3 of them, all dated after my termination. Rachel didn't even pick them up. You understand, she said calmly. That retroactive documentation doesn't cure a procedural failure. It confirms it. The HR director flushed. These concerns were communicated verbally. Rachel nodded. Then your policy was violated verbally too. That's when the senior vice president spoke. Claire, let's be realistic. Litigation will be stressful, expensive. It could impact your career. I met his eyes. So could being labeled a poor performer without evidence. They offered me 12 weeks of severance, then 16, then 20. Each increase came faster than the last. Rachel leaned back, hands folded. You're negotiating against yourselves, she said, which tells me, this goes deeper than one employee. She was right. Discovery would expose patterns, how often Northbridge skipped documentation, how many people were quietly pushed out under the same vague language. Companies fear patterns more than accusations. Patterns turn mistakes into practices. We declined the offer and left. 2 days later, Rachel filed a complaint in federal court alleging wrongful termination, breach of contract, and misrepresentation. Northbridge's stock dipped 0.5 point the next morning. By the end of the week, 3 former employees reached out to me on LinkedIn with eerily similar stories. Different departments, same language, same missing paperwork. The fear shifted then. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about a system that relied on people not knowing their rights, not reading page 11, not asking where Exhibit C went. Northbridge assumed I'd pack up my desk, take the severance, and disappear quietly into the job market. Instead, I'd done the one thing they didn't plan for. I paid attention. Discovery cracked everything open. Once the lawsuit survived Northbridge's motion to dismiss, the tone changed from confident to cautious. Then from cautious to frantic. Rachel explained it to me over coffee one morning like she was describing a weather pattern. Now they have to produce documents, emails, Slack messages, performance data. They can't just tell a story anymore, they have to prove one, and proof, it turned out, was not Northbridge's strength. The first document dump arrived 3 weeks later, thousands of pages. Rachel's junior associates flagged patterns while I focused on names I recognized. That's when I saw it, an internal spreadsheet titled Q3 Talent Optimization. My name sat neatly in column B with a note in column F that read, high cost, low adaptability, not low performance, not missed targets. High cost. The word thudded in my chest. I scrolled further. 12 other names, all over 40, all with above-average salaries, all terminated within 6 months. Rachel called me that night. Claire, this is bigger than we thought. How big? Pattern in practice, big. Northbridge's internal emails were worse. Executives openly discussed resetting, culture, and refreshing legacy. Talent. 1. Message from a regional director said, performance-based exits are cleaner. Less severance. Fewer questions. Another replied, just make sure HR paper looks complete. It was like watching people plan a crime and forget anyone might read the transcript. Depositions began in early spring. My former manager testified first. Under oath, he admitted he'd never issued me a written warning. HR followed, conceding that no performance improvement plan had ever been created. When Rachel asked why, HR's answer was painfully honest. We were under time pressure. Pressure, apparently. Justified ignoring policy. Then came the deposition of the senior vice president, the one who'd warned me about my career. Rachel projected the talent optimization spreadsheet onto the screen. Can you explain what high-cost, low adaptability means? He hesitated. It's a strategic assessment. Is it a performance metric? No. Then why was Ms. Donovan terminated for performance? Silence. The court reporter's keys clicked like a metronome, counting seconds of discomfort. That moment alone was worth months of stress. Settlement talks resumed immediately. The numbers jumped. 200,000. 500. 1 million. Each offer came with tighter confidentiality language. Rachel pushed them back every time. No secrecy, she said. You don't get to pay to keep a bad system intact. Northbridge resisted until their own board got involved. Shareholders don't like lawsuits that suggest age. Discrimination, disguised as performance management. While negotiations dragged on, something unexpected happened. Journalists started calling, then regulators, then former employees, dozens of them sharing stories that mirrored mine almost word for word. I realized then how quiet injustice depends on isolation. How easily companies get away with things when people think they're alone. By the time Northbridge agreed to a settlement north of $2 million, The money felt secondary. What mattered was the admission written, sign that my termination had not followed company policy and should not have been classified as performance-based. That sentence mattered. It meant I wasn't difficult. I wasn't low adaptability. I was right. The night after we signed, I slept for 12 straight hours. Not because I'd won, but because for the first time since 5:02 p.m. on that Wednesday, I wasn't carrying their lie anymore. Winning didn't feel like fireworks. It felt like quiet, the kind of quiet that settles in after a storm when you're finally able to hear your own thoughts again. The settlement hit my account on a Thursday morning, and I stared at the number longer than I expected to. Not because it was life-changing money, though it was, but because it represented something rarer: acknowledgement. Northbridge didn't just pay me to go away. They admitted they were wrong. Companies hate doing that more than they hate losing money. What I didn't anticipate was the ripple effect. 2 weeks after the settlement became public record, my inbox started filling with messages from people I'd never met. This happened to me too. Same language, different companies. I thought I was crazy until I read your case. One woman wrote that she'd been fired for attitude concerns after returning from maternity leave. A man in his early 50s said he'd been labeled not aligned with future vision and escorted out with no warning after. 17 years. Different industries, same script. Vague words. Missing documentation. Silent exits. Rachel called it the shadow economy of terminations. Cases that never make it to court because people are tired, scared, or financially cornered. Most companies count on exhaustion, she told me. They know compliance with their own policies is optional if no one challenges them. That sentence stayed with me. A month later, a recruiter reached out about a role at another fintech firm. During the interview, the hiring manager asked about Northbridge. I told the truth. I explained the lawsuit calmly, without bitterness. I talked about documentation, controls, and governance failures. He nodded slowly, then surprised me by saying, "Honestly, that makes me trust you more." That's when I realized the narrative doesn't belong to the company forever. Sometimes you get to take it back. Northbridge, meanwhile, was scrambling. Their board commissioned an external audit of termination practices. 3 executives stepped down. HR policies were rewritten with sharper language and actual enforcement mechanisms. Former employees were quietly contacted and offered settlements. None of that made headlines, but it mattered. Systems don't change because of apologies. They change because ignoring rules becomes more expensive than following them. I started speaking at compliance workshops, then conferences. I told my story without dramas, just facts, timelines, documents. I showed page 11. I explained. Exhibit C. I watched rooms full of managers shift uncomfortably in their seats. Afterwards, people lined up to ask questions. What if the performance issues are real? What if documentation slows us down? I gave the same answer every time. Then slow down. The process exists to protect everyone, including you. The strangest part was realizing how close I'd come to missing it. If I'd skimmed instead of read, if I'd been too embarrassed to ask about a missing exhibit, if I'd assumed companies always know what they're doing, that single moment pausing on page 11 changed the trajectory of my life. I don't tell this story because lawsuits are glamorous. They're not. I tell it because power depends on ignorance more than authority. And once you know how the system is supposed to work, you start seeing exactly where it breaks. About 6 months after everything settled, I received an email from someone still inside Northbridge. No name, no title, just a personal account. Sent from a burner address that read, "They changed the rules 'cause of you. People don't get walked out anymore without warnings." I stared at the screen for a long time before replying with a simple, "I hope you're safe." That message meant more to me than any settlement number. It meant the machine had been forced to slow down. I'd gone back to consultant by then, advising companies on compliance frameworks and internal controls. Ironically, the same type of work I'd been doing before, just with a sharper edge. When executives asked why documentation mattered so much, I didn't quote regulations. I told them about a Wednesday evening, a missing exhibit, and a phone call at 1:46 a.m. Stories stick where statutes don't. One afternoon, after a workshop in Denver, a young analyst pulled me aside. "They're building a case against my manager?" she whispered. "No write-ups, no PIP, just meetings that feel off." I didn't tell her what to do. I told her what to look for. Policies, timelines, words like must instead of may. Her relief was visible, like someone had turned on a light in a room she didn't realize was dark. What still surprises me is how ordinary it all was. No dramatic villains twirling mustaches, just people optimizing spreadsheets, treating human beings like line items that could be adjusted without consequence. Northbridge didn't wake up one day and decide to be unethical. They decided to be efficient. And when efficiency conflicts with fairness, fairness usually loses unless someone notices. Sometimes I think about the version of me who walked into that conference room believing she was about to be told how to improve. That version trusted process because she helped design it. What she didn't know yet was that processes only protect you if you insist they're followed. Otherwise, they're just words in a binder. I keep a copy of that original separation packet in my home office now. Page 11 is highlighted. Exhibit C is still missing. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Power doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it shows up as an omission, hoping no one will ask why. If there's a lesson in all of this, it isn't sue your employer, it's pay attention. Read what you're given. Ask for what's missing. Understand that policies are promises companies make to themselves as much as to you. When they break those promises, it's rarely an accident. It's a calculation. And calculations can be challenged. I didn't set out to become a case study or a cautionary tale. I just refused to sign my name to a story that wasn't true. The rest followed naturally. Systems resist accountability until they can't. All it takes is one person who reads the footnotes, notices the silence where evidence should be, and decides that quiet compliance isn't the same thing as consent. The phone doesn't ring at 1:46 a.m. anymore, but if it did, I know exactly how I'd answer. The strangest consequence of all this wasn't the money or the career shift. It was how my relationship with authority changed. Before Northbridge, I believed systems were fundamentally rational. Flawed, yes, but anchored in logic. If rules existed, someone would follow them. If policies were written, they mattered. What I learned instead was simpler and more unsettling. Rules only matter when someone enforces them, and enforcement usually begins with the least powerful person in the room refusing to stay quiet. I started noticing things everywhere. Friends would describe being managed out with no warning. Family members would talk about sudden restructures that somehow always targeted the same people. Even casual conversations revealed how normalized vague justifications had become. Not a culture fit, performance didn't align. Business needs changed. Language designed to sound neutral while erasing accountability. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. At one consulting engagement, a senior executive pulled me aside after my presentation. "You make it sound risky to terminate anyone," he said, half joking. "No," I replied. "I make it sound risky to cut corners." He laughed, that his eyes didn't. He knew exactly what I meant. What stayed with me most was how close the outcome had been to something very different if I'd been a little younger, a little more insecure, a little more eager to please. I might have signed and moved on without reading if I'd needed that severance immediately to cover rent. I might have ignored the missing exhibit out of fear. The system depends on those pressures. It counts on urgency, shame, and exhaustion to keep people compliant. I began mentoring early career professionals informally, especially women, not about ambition or leadership buzzwords, but about leverage, about understanding how power actually works when things go wrong. I told them, "Your calm questions are more threatening than your anger. Your paper trail matters more than your title." Watching them realize that was deeply personal for me. It felt like paying forward something I'd learned the hard way. Occasionally, I'd get updates about Northbridge through the industry grapevine. Revenue recovered. New leadership branded themselves as reformers. Internally, things were supposedly better. I didn't take pleasure in their discomfort, but I did take satisfaction in knowing they'd lost the luxury of laziness. Someone, somewhere, would always remember what happened when they ignored their own rules. One evening, while cleaning out old files, I found my original onboarding paperwork from years earlier. Buried in it was a value statement about integrity and accountability. I laughed out loud, not bitterly, just honestly. Values are easy to print, harder to live by. Even harder to live by when they cost money. I folded the paper and put it back. Not everything needs to be thrown away to be learned from. I don't consider myself brave. I consider myself observant, and in environments built on assumptions of silence, observation is disruptive. All I really did was notice what wasn't there and refuse to pretend that absence didn't matter. That, it turns out, is often enough. By the time 2026 rolled around, I had transitioned fully into consulting and training, traveling between New York, San Francisco, and Chicago for workshops on corporate governance, compliance, and employment policy. Clients ranged from startups with 5 employees to Fortune 500 companies with sprawling HR departments. Each time I walked into a boardroom, I could see the subtle tension. Executives were smart people. They understood regulations, metrics, and outcomes, but few fully grasped the human dimension of policy compliance until I showed them the consequences. I lay out a timeline: termination, missing documentation, retroactive excuses, and settlement. Then I'd watch the room go quiet. The silence was a lesson in itself. It wasn't just about rules. It was about culture. One CFO confessed that their department got creative when managers couldn't produce proper performance documentation. Two admitted he had encouraged HR to accelerate transitions without creating PIPs. My job wasn't to shame them. It was to illuminate what could happen when small shortcuts become systemic habits. I used my story as a case study, anonymized but detailed enough to be believable. I showed them how Isley processes could be manipulated, how one oversight could cascade into millions of dollars lost and reputations tarnished. Then I asked pointedly, "What's your Exhibit C?" Heads would shift uncomfortably. The personal cost was still there, though less immediate. I sometimes felt the social repercussions in the finance and tech industries. Even after the settlement, some colleagues or recruiters viewed me as litigious, someone who made waves. I had to explain repeatedly that vigilance doesn't equal obstinacy, that asking questions, checking footnotes, and challenging missing documentation isn't about being difficult, it's about preserving fairness. Slowly, perceptions shifted. People began to understand that compliance and ethics aren't just boxes to tick. They're protections for everyone, including leadership. And once that insight clicked, it rippled outward. At home, my life normalized in ways that surprised me. Weekends were no longer shadowed by the fear of email alerts from Northbridge. I could read without obsessively checking for updates or thinking about retroactive paperwork. I cooked dinner with my partner, laughed at things that weren't work-related, and realized that stress, once constant, had dissolved. That clarity allowed me to focus on professional growth instead of damage control, and yet the lessons from page 11 lingered. I couldn't unsee the consequences of overlooking policy. The missing exhibit had been a small detail, but it had revealed everything. I also began mentoring younger employees in corporate compliance programs and leadership workshops. I taught them how to document correctly, how to ask for transparency, and why being methodical even in small administrative tasks can be the difference between career security and being vulnerable to arbitrary decisions. They didn't just nod, they applied it immediately. Their emails, notes, and memos became more precise, more accountable. And I realized that the ripple effect of noticing a missing document can extend far beyond a single lawsuit. Northbridge itself became a recurring lesson in conversations with clients. I didn't discuss names or settlements. I discussed patterns, vague performance claims, retroactive paperwork, systemic shortcuts. I framed it as a cautionary tale, a live example of what happens when organizations prioritize expediency over procedure. And each time I did, I reminded them the quietest oversight is often the most expensive mistake. By the time I reflected on everything a year later, I realized the most valuable lesson wasn't about winning a settlement or exposing corporate malpractice. It was about attention, about noticing what's missing, about refusing to accept half-truths, about understanding that policies, when ignored, can harm everyone involved. I began writing articles not for profit but to educate others. Titles like Why Page 11 Matters and Exhibit C, The Power of Missing Documentation, circulated through HR networks, LinkedIn groups, and corporate newsletters. I received dozens of emails from people thanking for giving them the language and framework to challenge arbitrary decisions. I weren't seeking glory, I was seeking validation and tools. And I had them. That felt like the most profound victory. I also recognized the cost of staying silent. Before my case, I had colleagues who quietly left companies without speaking up, believing it was simpler than risking conflict. Their losses went unseen, their voices ignored. My settlement and the subsequent ripple effect, multiple. Employees receiving restitution. Policy reforms at Northbridge demonstrated the power of insistence. Standing up didn't just protect me, it created a precedent, a roadmap for others, a warning that the absence of accountability has consequences. In a way, my actions amplified the voices of everyone who had been dismissed silently, unfairly, without recourse. Consulting engagements grew more challenging and more rewarding as I wove my story into practical advice. Executives often said, "We know the rules," but we never really internalized them. I showed them the consequences of rushing terminations, retroactively fabricating documentation, and ignoring policy language. I demonstrated how litigation isn't just expensive, it exposes systematic weaknesses that investors, regulators, and employees will eventually uncover. Each seminar, each conversation reinforced a simple principle: vigilance is a competitive advantage. It protects not only the employee, but the organization itself. The professional recognition came gradually. I was invited to speak at national HR conferences, corporate law seminars, and operational management summits. People asked how I managed fear, stress, and the power imbalance. I didn't give them a dramatic answer. I told the truth: preparation, attention to detail, and knowing your rights matter far more than bravado. I emphasize documentation, both creating it and reviewing what's provided to you. I showed them how page numbers, footnotes, and appendices can be shields or weapons depending on who's paying attention. Ultimately, my story isn't about me. It's about systems, accountability, and human behavior in professional environments. The missing Exhibit C was a catalyst, but the real lesson is broader. Notice the gaps, insist on compliance, and don't underestimate the leverage that comes from understanding the rules better than the people trying to enforce or evade them. I've seen what happens when organizations ignore their own policies. I've watched careers, reputations, and millions of dollars lost because people assume no one would notice. And I've learned that noticing isn't just awareness, it's power. Today, I work with companies to prevent those failures before they occur, train employees to recognize red flags, and encourage transparency at every level. When I talk to audiences across the country, I often start with a simple question: what's missing? It's a question that changed my life, protected my career, and ultimately reshaped an entire company's approach to fairness and compliance. And it all began with one page, one clause, and one refusal to look away.